Hello world, it's been a while. It's time for another installment of my very sporadic podcast. Today, talking about balancing science and woo. There's a lot to cover on this topic, and for those watching the video, my cat is here to help. There's a lot to cover on this topic. Honestly, it could and maybe should be it really should be a college course taught by someone smarter and better qualified than me, but I'm not intending to get to that level of detail here, so hopefully I'll be okay, and hopefully we all get to learn something new. So what my cat. Yes, you are a love. So what I want to talk about today is how I try and balance my love of science with my fascination of things that many should honestly call pseudoscience. How do I look at the data and try to interpret the data, and how might I respond to someone else's interpretation of the data and the kind of statements they might make? We are all biased in different ways. The moment someone interprets the data, there's a bias put on the data. This is why science tries to present just the data when possible, tries to eliminate as much bias as possible. But sometimes there's even bias with how the data was collected. But we don't need to go down that rabbit hole just yet. Let me start off by giving an example. Acupuncture. If you look at the data, at the studies, there's a lot of studies that show acupuncture to be placebo. I mean, I can give you a couple of websites that I really respect that cite their sources and have a lot of high quality evidence to back up their persuasive arguments that acupuncture is placebo. On the flip side of that, there are well-respected medical universities and government organizations with whole departments dedicated to studying the effects and biomechanical processes through which acupuncture works. So which is it? Does it actually work, or is it placebo? Should we just hand out sugar pills instead of putting on this whole show, or are needles actually doing something? It's complicated, and probably both are true. Acupuncture is a rather broad subject, and any treatment is inherently multifactorial. It has the interactions with the client and the practitioner. Every client has a different problem that needs to be treated. There are over 360 points to choose from, and they can be used in countless combinations. There are multiple ways of stimulating each point. It often includes massage as well. Many acupuncturists also practice East Asian herbology. I'm sure I missed about 10 other factors. As you can see, there's a lot of things that go on during a session, but you can't look at all of that in one study. You can't even look at all of that. With 10 studies, it takes hundreds, thousands to do it properly. I'm going to take a moment here to discuss how research works now, what you can study and how to do it. I'm not super versed on the philosophy and history of science and how studies conducted in the modern West differ from how they would have been done if other cultures had evolved to be the predominant philosophical source. And in some countries it is a little bit. China does conduct studies a little bit differently sometimes. And there's strengths and weaknesses to these philosophical discussions, but it's really fascinating. I really want to learn more about that. But for now, I'm going to be talking about how science works in the modern Western culture. A scientific study is about trying to be as objective as possible and distance yourself from what you're studying. The idea behind distancing yourself is in hopes that you can see the purest form of truth. It's easier and usually better to observe what life is in a pond if you don't splash around in the pond. You want to see the fish that are there, don't hop in. But instead, keep your distance. Just watch. The same can be true with people and medicine as well. When you're trying to study back pain, for example, you use your friends, you might start seeing correlations that just aren't relevant. Like, if they have a crush on someone or if their car check engine light is on. Silly random things that might become hard not to think about when conducting a study that can easily lead anyone, down a wild goose chase. The less factors, the better the study is, and the more you distance yourself and be objective, the less you are a factor yourself. It's still possible to look at too many things or at silly things, like maybe everyone who has back pain in your study also eats Doritos and has a single cat. But those that don't have back pain have no pets and eat Oreos and play Candy Crush on their phones. This might seem like a silly example, but when you look at too many factors, just like when you use your friends to conduct a study, it really can be that easy to start leading yourself down a wild goose chase when conducting studies. If possible, you try to test for a single factor at a time. This is where control groups come in. Quick review. You want to stay objective, which is easiest done by being distant and separate. And ideally, you want to be looking at a single factor. In other words, you should be unbiased and the experiment should be tightly controlled. Let me try and explain how hard it is to properly control an experiment and how easy it is to accidentally have an extra factor involved. I'm going to make up a study here. I have no idea what the actual results would be, but let's just say you wanted to see if walking helped with anxiety. So you get 100 people with anxiety to take a walk every day for 3 weeks. At the end of the 3 weeks, 75 people said they felt less anxious, while 25 had no change or got worse. All made up. That if that were to happen, that sounds like a pretty good result. 75% chance that walking will help you with your anxiety after 3 weeks. But do we actually know that walking had anything to do with that change? Let's go over some possible factors that were not controlled in this study. Where did they walk? Does it make a difference if you walk in a park, the woods, a construction site, or on a treadmill? Maybe the study would have had 100% improvement, but 25 people did their daily walks in noisy or dangerous places. How long were these walks? Did people walk for 5 minutes or an hour each day? And did that make a difference? Were these people doing anything else for their anxiety over those 3 weeks? Perhaps the only reason the 75% got better is because they were taking appropriate medications or changed their diets or got better jobs. What if walking isn't important, but just movement of any kind could give the same result? Could be swimming, jumping, rowing, swinging your arms while sitting in a chair. Or maybe it was the act of going outside for a bit and just sitting on the park bench would have had the same results. Or maybe it just took some time and they would have improved if they had done nothing at all. When considering all these uncontrollable factors, you can see now why this simple question, does walking help with anxiety, requires a lot of different studies to slowly get to the truth, one factor at a time. That said, a study like the one I made up here isn't worthless either. It doesn't actually prove anything. If that was the point or the claim made by the experimenters, well, then it's a poorly done study. But instead, it does give implications. It suggests that walking might be good for anxiety and is worth more study. It's a low-cost, easy study to do that can help direct future research. Had it gone the opposite direction, if 75% of people did not improve, then it would imply our efforts are better directed in studying something else. So you do often see poorly controlled studies like this, just as a simple first step, an initial study to see if it's worth spending the time and energy and money on doing a better study later. Now let's jump to discussing the most common method of controlling for factors, using what's called a control group. What you do is you take an idea for a study and you break it into 2 groups. They are almost the same, except for one difference. So taking the early example of walking for anxiety, let's say we were making a better study now. No one is doing anything else for the anxiety over these 3 weeks, such as medications. Everyone in the study lives in a similar kind of neighborhood, away from continuous loud noises. Everyone in the group is as similar as can be expected. And this time we have 200 people. Now we can make a control group. Last time, the 100 people, like last time, 100 people will walk every day. But we're going to put stipulations to control the factors. They will walk for 30 minutes on a treadmill in their house. Meanwhile, the other 100 people, they aren't going to walk at all. They're the control, acting as a baseline of sorts to compare with. This is a decently well-designed study because now we're looking at a single factor. Does a 30-minute walk on a treadmill help with anxiety? Next, we can look at if walking in a park makes a difference or any other factor. And there's always some hole. Perhaps sitting on the couch and not walking is in fact making things worse and is a different sort of factor. Maybe I should have said they just go about their daily lives normally and the 30-minute walk is an extra thing. But having two groups with a single difference still really helps us feel much more confident in our statements. Obviously, the statements are far less earth-shattering. We're moving much slower with our research, but we are doing a more thorough job. For anyone hearing rustling in the background, that is my cat playing in the corner. What are you doing? To make the study even better, we could randomize the participants. Maybe you've heard of a randomized controlled trial, or RTC for short. Well, we just discussed what a control trial is, where you have one group of people acting as the control. But how do we choose which people are in which group of the study? Ideally, we do so randomly. This would... What? Do you know about this stuff too? Randomizing the people would minimize any risk of accidentally putting all men in one group and all women in another. And that male versus female is a potential factor. Or accidentally separating by age, physical appearance, such as obesity or skin color. If we randomize it, we can still accidentally have issues like these, but it's far less likely. And if we conduct enough randomized control trials, we're very likely to get a good and fair spread such that it's done right, and factors like these are kind of taken care of. The next level is to make a study blind. It can be a single blind or a double blind. The ideal study is a double-blind randomized control trial. Bit of a mouthful, but you already know what a randomized control trial is. Let's just go over what it means to double-blind something. So this wouldn't work with our previous example of walking for anxiety. You'll see why in a minute. This kind of study is best done with medications, pharmaceuticals. Let's say we are testing a new drug to see if it really does help with mild low back pain. So we get 200 people with mild low back pain. We randomize them. Half are getting the new medication, half are getting a placebo or a sugar pill. But if someone knows they're getting a sugar pill, it'll change the placebo effect. And if someone's handed the real medicine but is told it's a sugar pill, they can have an almost negative placebo where it doesn't work as well. So the participants are blinded. They don't know if they're receiving the real thing or a placebo, so that the results can be as pure as possible. This is a single blind study. But it turns out that someone has to interact with them, ask them basic questions and hand them the pill to take, and then ask follow-up questions. And as it turns out, how they interact with that person affects the outcomes of the experiment. If the interaction is done with care, you get better results. In a mean way, worse results. And either way, this can significantly affect the results. So when possible, those interacting with participants are trained to treat everyone the same way, often choosing to be as stoic as possible. And this is far easier when they honestly don't know if they're handing someone the real medication or a sugar pill. No matter how stoic you try to be, if someone has a heart and they're listening to a heart-wrenching sob story of how long this person's been in pain, you don't want to knowingly hand them a placebo. It ends up being better if you just don't know. So both the researcher interacting with the participants and the participants themselves are blinded, resulting in a double-blind study. So now you know why people love double-blind randomized controls trials. They are pretty great. We haven't come up with a better experiment design than this. Except that there are many things that you can't put in an experiment like this. You can't make participants blind if is walking good for anxiety study. Like, how are they supposed to know if they're walking or not? They know. Sometimes you can't control factors of life that well. So you do what you can. And sometimes it's just an observation. You see a correlation and you record it. This is basically what naturalists do all the time. They go out in nature, they observe animals or whatever they're observing, weather, plants. They see correlations and they make educated guesses about an animal's behavior, for instance. That is science. And sometimes that's the best we can do. But it's very flawed and needs to be acknowledged as such. Clinicians will often make something called a case study or a case report. What that is an officially documented report of what happened with a client or patient. They're always done anonymously unless the client gives permission. HIPAA guidelines typically do a really good job of protecting people's privacy and keeping things confidential. An example of a case study might be from a massage therapist, say. Say I had a client come in with neuropathy issues. They haven't felt anything in their thumb for years. And after 5 sessions, they had a tingling sensation for an hour in that thumb. That's something I could write up in a case report. It's not a controlled study. It's an observation I'm putting in an official report. And ideally, I include as much information as possible. The person's condition, age, sex, demographic, what else they were doing for it, and as detailed a report as possible of what I did over those 5 sessions. This is not something I've done, just to be clear. It's a hypothetical thing. But you can find many of these case studies published for public to review. One on its own doesn't necessarily mean much. Certainly doesn't prove anything, but perhaps gives a suggestion for further research. But if there were 100 or 1,000 that said similar things, that gives a really strong implication. We can start to see trends and make some really good guesses from that. This is often how we reassess the effectiveness of procedures. We look at case reports of people 6 months or 6 years after a certain surgery, or any procedure really, to see how effective it is. Ideally, we would do a randomized single-blind control trial of thousands of people over years, but that's not really very realistic. Sometimes the best we can do is look at case reports. Just to be perfectly honest, some case reports are poorly done and make correlations that aren't related. This can happen a lot with the woo-y side of medicine, stating that this alternative approach healed someone without mentioning that the client was also doing other things for the issue. Perhaps you've heard of anecdotal data. Well, a case report is the most official form of anecdotal data, but it's still technically anecdotal. What that means is it's from a personal experience. You didn't separate yourself from it, meaning you couldn't be truly objective. So it wasn't observational. You didn't step back and just look at things. You were the clinician. You were part of it. You didn't conduct a study. You simply are citing your personal experience. The only thing weaker than anecdotal data is impersonal anecdotal data. Let's take ghosts for the example in this one. I'm not stating my personal belief on ghosts here. Maybe I believe in them and had personal encounters, maybe not. But a ghost experience is anecdotal data. It's a personal experience that can't be replicated. And maybe you haven't ever experienced an encounter with ghosts, but maybe you still believe in them because you trust those who have. That is trusting in another's anecdotal data. It's really hard to convince your friend ghosts are real when your only evidence is your friend's friend's friend says they saw one. That's not proof. There are just so many possible factors at play here. Obviously, you have to trust your own personal experiences. And as I said earlier, many studies are actually based on anecdotal data, such as how people feel years after a procedure. Another great example of superb anecdotal data is Jane Goodall. She was supposed to be objective, just observe, but she ended up being personally involved with those chimpanzees and learned so much more. So while a double-blind, randomized control trial is generally considered the best kind of experiment, and anecdotal is generally considered the worst, that's only because the double-blind randomized control trial is the hardest to mess up and be wrong, while the anecdotal is the easiest to mess up and be wrong. That's not to say we don't get double-blind randomized control trials wrong all the time, and anecdotal is never right. It's about trying to minimize human error. But in reality, you have to think for yourself. Consider as many factors as possible and realize that it's complicated and it depends. So this is why some organizations create hierarchies of evidence, ways to try and determine the strength of a study. But it's so complex that each organization will make their own slight variation of this. There's a great podcast for expecting parents made by a nurse, and in episode 2 she goes over quality of evidence. So if you want to learn more and get it from probably a better source than me, I highly recommend checking out the Evidence-Based Birth podcast, episode 2. I'll have the link in the show notes. And if you do listen to that, you'll see how what she says is similar but a little different than what I say, because it's complicated and it depends. Back to the hierarchy of evidence. Some say a double-blind randomized control trial is the best, most accurate. But most people actually say that a meta-analysis is better. A meta-analysis isn't an experiment. It's a study where you look at a bunch of smaller studies and experiments and you compare them all and essentially make a bigger study out of smaller ones. And it's great, but it depends on the quality of the smaller studies involved, and it's easy to accidentally include 1 or 2 poorly done studies and possibly corrupt the entire meta-analysis. I've included in the show notes the wiki page on hierarchy of evidence if you want to learn more. This stuff is most commonly being applied in evidence-based medical practices, but it's discussed in any field of science, really, just to different extents. In medicine, it's probably the most important due to lives potentially being at risk if something's wrong. Now, hopefully you understand how slow and tricky research is. And honestly, I've only scratched the surface here. You can get into the philosophy of science, why we conduct studies in this manner versus other manners, the potential advantages to not being objective. Like, sometimes it's better to do a study with your friends as participants, because otherwise you would never have seen certain connections. Be it a similar hobby or a shared influential moment in childhood. Sometimes it's bad, but sometimes it's good to be subjective, personal, and close to your study. Again, Jane Goodall's a great example. Obviously, there's even more still to discuss, like cross-cultural comparisons, subconscious biases, funding and financial conflicts, and so much more. Again, this could be a year-long college course, and I hope it is somewhere. Staying with our current research and what we do know, and seeing all these limitations of our understanding and slow speed of research, it's actually good to be skeptical of most claims made by professionals. Don't get me wrong, skeptical doesn't mean I don't trust my doctor, or that I instantly think a professional is wrong or lying. It means I wonder where they got the information from, and if it's being debated currently. The stronger the statement, the more I wonder this. A really good example of when to be super skeptical is if you see a video or article online that says, "Stop doing this for your health. Don't buy that food." Or reversely, "Do these 3 things to improve your health." The more confident and stronger the statement, the more skeptical I tend to be. Doctors don't tend to make statements quite that strong, at least anymore, and in general are really well educated. I do trust my doctor. So let's not touch on the pseudoscience stuff yet. Let's stay in the well-respected musculoskeletal world and look at a common thing people talk about as causing their pain that I'm a little skeptical of. Posture. How's my posture right now? Not great, not horrible, but it's probably got very little to do with my pain or discomfort at the moment. At least at the moment. How often have you heard that posture is bad? That's why your neck hurts or back hurts or whatever. These strong statements that seem to answer all your questions in a single sentence, we have decades of research now that challenges that notion, that posture is the end-all be-all that people have claimed. Obviously, there are postures that are bad for you, but those are pretty extreme, like twisting yourself up in a pretzel and then falling asleep on an airplane. But where do we get this claim that looking at my phone will mess up my neck? Plenty of jobs, both modern and ancient, require you to be in a similar position for hours every day. Jewelry making, engraving, wood carving, most fine detail work is like that. Knitting. So why wasn't this considered a thing in the past? Why isn't it silversmith neck or knitter's neck? Or so many others. But Instead, it's called tech neck, as if it's brand new. And I'm not really sure, because those people are just as likely to get neck pain as computer workers, which is to say, fairly common. Yet many don't have any neck pain at all. And I mean many people who do these jobs and activities that keep their head forward for hours on end. So where does this claim of posture being the root cause of your pain come from? Well, in the past, some clinicians focused on improving posture and people's pain went away. It's from case reports, that fancy version of anecdotal evidence. And over the years, there's been a lot of case reports, all focusing on posture. But as far as I'm aware, few, if any of those, actually look to see how much the person's posture really changed after the treatment. Because the person's pain and dysfunction improves, that's all that really matters. Once we got to actually making studies and experiments that looked at the effects and importance of posture, it very quickly seemed to have, in some of them, little to no importance. At least most of the time. Some people go so far as to say posture just doesn't matter, and anyone who's a posture expert hasn't read any of the science of the past 20 years. I'm not going nearly that far. It's a legit debate to be had. This is where we get into the interpretation of the evidence. The evidence says that you can't diagnose a person from posture alone. If there are 20 people in a room, 10 of them have pain, the other 10 are pain-free, you will not be able to tell reliably who has pain based on posture alone. The evidence also says that in certain positions and under certain loads, carrying loads or movement loads, your posture and movement pattern can exert enough force on your tissues to cause damage. Enough damage we would probably expect pain to occur. The evidence also says our bodies are great at healing it, and that damage will generally go away fairly quickly. So is posture important? If not, why do posture fixing regimens seem to help people with their pain and dysfunction? If you ask two different people, you'll get two different interpretations of the data. Neither is necessarily wrong. In either case, more research is required. So that's what I mean by you should be skeptical of any claim made by a professional. It really might be true beyond a doubt with all the science to back it up, but it also might be their interpretation of the data, and the science might be more complicated. It also could just be how they were taught, and only based on case reports. There are a couple of knee and shoulder surgeries still done today that are like that. Thankfully, there's some great people out there doing wonderful work to spread knowledge and information about those. Also, any short videos, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, that you see, be extra skeptical of those, because while many are great, most are not. Many are just dangerous. Even if they cite their sources in the video, be skeptical, because you might not agree with their interpretation of the data they're citing. Okay, I've established now that I'm skeptical of claims that we think of as well-established and well-accepted in modern medicine. And just to be clear, most of those claims made by modern medicine are accurate when you or I do the research. But, as I pointed out, not always. Which is why I say skeptical, not distrusting. Big difference for me. Now, as we get into some pseudoscience, metaphysical stuff, you hopefully are starting to see how I try to look at what data there is, and I try to interpret it in a fairly open-minded way. But for me, what really keeps me open-minded is looking at what data is just missing, what hasn't even been looked at or started to be studied yet. When you look at energy work, a term I hate, but it's the easiest one to use, there's very little research actually done. Part of that is because most scientists think it would be a waste of time and money, and for good reason. The idea that you can heal someone from across the room sounds ludicrous. Yet people routinely feel better after Reiki sessions, or sound baths, or whatever pseudoscientific energy healing session they get. Maybe it's just placebo. But placebo isn't a bad thing. As long as you aren't claiming that it's all you need. I want to do a whole episode on placebo, so I won't go into that too much right now, but placebo can help you heal. But it's not something that should replace other medicines. It can be an addition to. So I have no problem with pretty much any style of medicine, even ones that I am more skeptical of. as long as they aren't trying to create distrust in modern medical doctors and the modern medicine. Please trust modern medicine. It's amazing. And yes, it's healthy to ask questions and be a little skeptical at times, to do your own research. But understand and know that doctors are lifesavers and amazing. And these pseudoscientific healing styles are complementary, not alternative to. Okay, back to what hasn't been studied. There are things in East Asian medicine where if you stub your toe, you can rub the opposite finger and the pain and swelling will go down almost instantly. It's amazing. It's super simple. And I have no idea how it actually works because it hasn't been studied. You know, stub the big toe on this side and you rub your thumb on this side and it helps. I've seen it. I've done it. All I have is anecdotal evidence. In theory, I could find old writings about it from ancient doctors, but that's all case reports. Anecdotal evidence. I have my own experiences using the technique. I could write such a case report, but it's anecdotal. Obviously, I feel very confident that it works, based on my own clinical observations. Fancy way of saying anecdotal. I can give you ancient Asian narratives of what it does and how it works. And maybe they're right, but from a modern understanding of the body, a modern scientific analysis of our anatomy and physiology, I have no idea how this works. The traditional narrative is that you're going to the opposite point of the body to encourage blood flow. When you injure yourself, that area slows down the circulation and starts to swell. But if you go to the opposite point and rub it, you tell the body to draw blood and energy, encouraging circulation. And this is a big effect on the opposite point of the body, encouraging balance, and as such, removing swelling and pain. Could be right. If you think of the body as a closed circuit, like a donut or a ring filled with water, squeeze one spot and the opposite spot will swell the most. Now push on the opposite spot and you can kind of even it out and normalize the whole ring. Maybe that's how it works, but I doubt it's that simple. And I don't know. So I say I personally know it works, but I don't know how. But if something works, we should be able to prove it, right? Just have a control versus nothing, and it shows that it works, right? Not quite. Let's say you're treating neck pain. Let's make them another study. 100 people, 50 get nothing to help, 50 get acupuncture. And to simplify, let's say those 50 people got the exact same acupuncture treatment. Now the half that got acupuncture will have better results. Again, we're making this up. The half that got acupuncture got better results. More of them will have a greater decrease in pain, but it's still possible that they only got better because acupuncture is a placebo. So we need to throw in a third arm to the study. Another 50 people who either get fake acupuncture or a sugar pill. Now we have a good comparison. And in this study, I honestly don't know if acupuncture would perform better or the same as placebo. The thing is, in this made-up experiment, everyone's getting the same acupuncture treatment, but that's not what would happen in an acupuncturist's office. Even though it seems like the same issue, neck pain, that's not nearly specific enough for an acupuncturist or anyone who really treats neck pain. How recently did the pain start? Is it in the front, side, or back of the neck? What makes it worse? Has anything helped with the pain in the past? Is it a dull ache or a sharp pain? So on and so on. No two people with neck pain would get the exact same treatment. And the same is true if we were to look at anyone who treats this, massage therapist, chiropractic, physical therapy. Hopefully you're starting to see how these modalities can be both placebo and real depending on the study, depending on the situation. What seems to be a really well-designed study to one person might seem poorly designed to another. This is because we were trying to look at a single factor when what we're studying is inherently multifactorial. The second you have two different people as part of the study, you have a lot of different factors at play. And add to that the complex medicine you're trying to analyze, not just a single pill. It's almost impossible, yet we're still trying and making great headway. When looking at something as vast and complex as acupuncture and East Asian medicine, especially when looking at it just one factor at a time, you will come across things that are placebo and wrong. You will come across things that are real and effective. you'll get a lot of both. There's so much of both that people will take the side they want. It's fake or it's real, and they'll ignore the other evidence because they're right. It's both real and fake. Some of the herbs used are amazing and getting turned into modern pharmaceuticals. Others aren't really that great and don't need to be used at all. The same may be true of acupoints. Some have been shown to be neurovascular bundles and do have a real effect on the body, though we might not be sure how or why. Others we haven't seen any effects from yet, but maybe they just haven't been studied in the right context, or they need to be combined with another point, or maybe they just don't work. I don't know. There's still a lot of research to actually do. There's so much research to be done, and that's just in acupuncture, much less other forms of medicine. I hope to do an episode on acupuncture in the future and the studies for it and everything. For now, I'm just using it as a hypothetical example. In conclusion, the research is painfully complex, slow, and limited, but still amazing. So I try to be open to what we don't know, and I try to be clear on what the data says versus how I interpret it. But everything's so complicated, and there's often more than one right answer. Like how acupuncture is both placebo and effective. That I simply stay skeptical. I'm skeptical of what I hear, of what I read, and most importantly, of myself. I'm open to using whatever seems to work, but I rarely claim to know how or why it works. I'm always open to being proven wrong. So do your research. And that research should include asking your doctors or whatever professional is appropriate. But also stay skeptical. Most importantly, of your own opinions. That was a mouthful. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you learned something. And hopefully I'll see you next time.